Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet, shadowed, and incense-laced world of medieval monastic life. The hidden rhythms of every stone cloister, the sacred silence where devotion, obsession, and secrecy could all whisper under the same vaulted roof. It wasn't just a life of prayer, it was a life where discipline, isolation, forbidden curiosity, and quiet rebellion lived side by side beneath the weight of ancient vows and candlelit manuscripts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Far from the bustling towns and muddy farms, nestled in the hills or behind thick monastery walls, lived men who had turned away from the world, monks of the medieval age. Their existence was a deliberate act of separation, a profound commitment to a life devoted entirely to God, unburdened by the material desires and societal pressures of the outside world. For these individuals, the monastery wasn't just a building, it was a sanctuary, a spiritual forge where their souls were refined through rigorous discipline and unwavering faith. Life within the monastic community was governed by strict rules, most famously the rule of Saint Benedict, which laid out a comprehensive framework for daily living. This wasn't a life of idleness. Monks adhered to a meticulously structured routine, rising before dawn for the first of many prayer services, known as the Divine Office or Liturgy of the Hours. These services, held at regular intervals throughout the day and night, punctuated their lives with psalms, hymns, and scripture readings, ensuring a constant focus on the spiritual. Between these periods of communal prayer, monks engaged in a variety of activities essential to the self-sufficiency and mission of the monastery. Manual labor was a cornerstone of monastic life. Monks cultivated their own gardens, growing vegetables and herbs for food and medicinal purposes. They tended to livestock, brewed their own ale or wine, and often engaged in crafts like carpentry or masonry, contributing to the upkeep and expansion of their monastic homes. This physical work was not merely practical, it was also considered a form of humility and a way to avoid idleness, which was seen as a temptation to sin. Perhaps one of the most significant contributions of medieval monks was their dedication to learning and scholarship. In an era when literacy was rare, monasteries became vital centers for the preservation and transmission of knowledge. Scribes meticulously copied religious texts, classical literature, and philosophical works by hand in the scriptorium, often spending countless hours illuminating manuscripts with intricate designs and vibrant colors. Without their tireless efforts, much of the ancient knowledge that forms the foundation of Western thought would have been lost to history. Monasteries also often maintained impressive libraries, serving as repositories of wisdom and learning for centuries. Beyond their internal routines, monasteries often served as important hubs for their surrounding communities. They provided charity to the poor and sick, offering food, shelter, and basic medical care. Some monasteries operated schools, providing education to local children, while others became pilgrimage sites, drawing visitors seeking spiritual solace or healing. Monks, through their prayers and perceived closeness to God, were also sought out for spiritual guidance and counsel. While the monastic ideal emphasized withdrawal from the world, the reality was that monasteries were deeply intertwined with medieval society. They held significant land, wielded political influence, and often served as centers of economic activity. Yet, at their core, the lives of medieval monks were defined by their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a deliberate renunciation of worldly comforts in pursuit of a higher spiritual calling. Their quiet devotion, scholarly pursuits, and communal living left an indelible mark on the medieval landscape, shaping its religious, cultural, and intellectual life in profound ways. They wore plain robes, kept their heads shaved, and lived by rules more ancient than the lands they guarded. To the outside world, they seemed quiet, holy, and harmless. But behind those cloistered walls, mysteries brewed. The stone of St. Augustine's Abbey, a venerable edifice nestled deep within the shadowed valleys of the Blackwood Forest, had seen centuries pass. Its existence was a testament to enduring faith, a beacon of piety in a world often consumed by strife. Yet, for all its outward sanctity, St. Augustine's held secrets as deeply ingrained as the moss on its ancient walls, secrets whispered only in the dead of night, or hinted at in the haunted eyes of a newly arrived novice. Brother Thomas, a man whose youth had been spent amidst the clamor of a merchant's guild, found himself ill-suited to the monastic silence. He had sought the cloister not out of fervent devotion, but out of a desperate need for refuge, a past he wished to bury as deeply as the abbey's foundations. The rhythmic toll of the bells, the endless cycle of prayer, the monotony of his chores, it was all a thin veil over a gnawing unease. The monks, seemingly devout and humble, possessed an unsettling uniformity. Their gazes were often averted, their conversations clipped and precise, devoid of the natural banter Thomas remembered from the outside world. The first true ripple in the abbey's placid surface came with the disappearance of Brother Elias. Elias, a frail, elderly man who spent his days painstakingly illuminating manuscripts in the scriptorium, had vanished without a trace. His stool was pushed neatly under his desk, his tools laid out, a half-finished page of intricate scripture lying open. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the parchment itself. Abbot Marcus, a man whose stern countenance and unwavering gaze commanded instant obedience, declared it a divine calling, an ascension perhaps, or a quiet departure to seek solitude in the wilderness. But Thomas, a man whose past had taught him to scrutinize shadows, felt a prickle of doubt. Monks did not simply vanish, especially not Elias, who clung to the routine of the abbey like a limpet to a rock. Days turned into weeks, and the silence surrounding Elias's disappearance grew heavier, more oppressive. Thomas began to observe. He noticed the furtive glances exchanged between Brother Gregory, the abbey's taciturn librarian, and Brother Benedict, the master of the novices, a man whose pious facade barely concealed a simmering impatience. He saw the unusual intensity in the eyes of the abbot during evening prayers, a flicker of something beyond spiritual fervor. One cold, moonless night, driven by an inexplicable compulsion, Thomas slipped from his cell. The abbey was a labyrinth of echoing corridors, illuminated only by the faint glow of the night lamps. His feet, bare against the cold stone, made no sound as he crept towards the scriptorium, a place that felt strangely significant in Elias's absence. The door was unlocked, a detail that struck Thomas as odd. The scriptorium usually remained secured. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and beeswax. His gaze fell upon Elias's unfinished work. It was a page from the book of Job, intricately detailed, but something was amiss. Tucked into the intricate border, almost imperceptible, was a tiny, hastily drawn symbol, a stylized raven with a single, unblinking eye. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He had seen that symbol before, in the shadowy corners of the world he had left behind, a mark associated with ancient, forbidden knowledge, with covens and hermetic societies. It was utterly out of place in a holy text. He quickly re-examined the other completed pages on Elias's desk. Hidden within the elaborate flourishes and floral patterns, he found similar, though more subtly integrated, symbols: a coiled serpent, a crescent moon, an hourglass with sand flowing upwards. Elias, the gentle, unassuming illuminator, had been embedding secret messages within the sacred texts. His heart pounding, Thomas hurried to the abbey library, a vast chamber filled with the hushed whispers of forgotten wisdom. Brother Gregory was there, as always, hunched over a tome, his back to the door. Thomas hesitated, then, feigning a need for a specific text, entered. As Gregory turned, his eyes, usually clouded with scholarly absorption, held a glint of something sharp, predatory. Thomas's gaze fell upon the section Elias had frequented: ancient theological treatises, obscure philosophical texts, and surprisingly, several volumes on alchemy and hermeticism, their spines worn from frequent handling. This was no ordinary monastic library. The pieces began to fall into place with terrifying speed. The overly strict routine, the unnatural silence, the averted gazes, they weren't just signs of monastic discipline, but of a shared secret, a deep, pervasive conspiracy. Elias hadn't vanished, he had been silenced. And the raven, the serpent, the symbols, they weren't just symbols. They were the key to a hidden order operating within the very heart of the abbey, an order perhaps perverting its holy mission for purposes Thomas could barely comprehend. That night, Thomas could not sleep. The pious chants that drifted from the chapel no longer soothed him, they sounded like an ominous dirge. The quiet clinking of Brother Gregory's censer during matins now felt less like incense and more like a warning. St. Augustine's Abbey was not just a place of prayer, it was a sanctuary for something far older, far darker, than the faith it outwardly professed. The ancient rules, the shaved heads, the plain robes, they were but a masterfully crafted disguise, concealing a truth that brewed in the shadows, threatening to spill over and consume all who stumbled upon it. Thomas, a refugee from one kind of darkness, now found himself trapped in another, far more insidious one, behind the very walls he had believed would offer him salvation. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the mystery of Elias was merely the first thread in a much larger, more dangerous tapestry, and that his own survival now depended on unraveling it. Each day began in darkness. Long before the first hint of dawn brushed the eastern sky, the deep, sonorous bells of the monastery would shatter the profound silence of the night, echoing through stone halls and stirring the monks from their brief, often restless, slumber. This was not a gentle awakening. There was no coffee, no comfort of a warm hearth, only the biting chill of cold stone floors under bare feet, the whispered murmur of Latin prayers, and the inexorable pull towards hours of devotion. This was the rhythm of monastic life, a relentless, divinely ordained schedule meticulously laid out by the rule of Saint Benedict, a blueprint for spiritual perfection that had governed countless monasteries across medieval Europe for centuries. For men who had forsaken the temporal world, time itself was consecrated, each hour, each minute, offered as a sacrifice to God. The first summons, often around 2 a.m., was for matins, also known as vigils. Groggy but disciplined, the monks would rise from their simple pallets in the unheated dormitory. They pulled on their coarse woolen habits, feeling the rough fabric against their skin. The only light came from flickering oil lamps or the moon if it pierced the narrow, high windows. As they shuffled silently towards the chapel or choir, the air was thick with the scent of old stone, dampness, and the faint, lingering smell of beeswax from the previous day's services. Once gathered in the choir stalls, arranged facing each other across the central aisle, the chanting would begin. It was a deep, resonant sound, often starting with a single voice, then swelling as others joined, filling the vast space with the ancient melodies of Gregorian chant. Psalms were recited or sung, lessons from scripture or the writings of the church fathers were read aloud, interspersed with hymns and prayers. This first service could last for a considerable time, perhaps an hour or more, a demanding spiritual and physical exercise in the darkest hours of the night. It was a test of endurance, a constant battle against the urge to drift back into sleep, a profound act of humility and submission. After matins, there might be a short period for private prayer or quiet reflection, or the monks might return to their cells for another brief, interrupted period of sleep before the next call. The second service, lauds, or morning prayer, typically arrived with the first gray light of dawn, around 5 a.m. This service marked the breaking of the day, a new beginning consecrated with further psalms, hymns, and readings, often with a theme of praise and thanksgiving for the new day. With the rising sun came the practical duties. After lauds, there was usually a communal gathering in the chapter house. Here, the abbot, the spiritual father and temporal ruler of the monastery, would read a chapter from the rule of Saint Benedict, offering commentary and guidance. It was also the place for confessions, for the assignment of daily tasks, and for discussing any matters pertaining to the community. This was where the practical governance of the monastery took place, where discipline was maintained, and where the communal spirit was reinforced. Following the chapter, it was time for prime, the third service of the day, around 6 a.m. This was typically a shorter service, marking the first hour of the day, with a focus on protection and blessing for the day's work. Then came the period of manual labor. This was no small part of monastic life. Idleness was considered an enemy of the soul. Monks might work in the monastery's fields, cultivating grain or vegetables in the abbey's gardens. Others might be in the kitchens, preparing simple meals, in the brewery, crafting ale or wine, or in the workshops, engaged in carpentry, masonry, or other necessary crafts for the upkeep of the monastic complex. For the more learned, this might involve teaching the novices, maintaining the library, or, most famously, working in the scriptorium. Here, in hushed silence, scribes would meticulously copy manuscripts by hand, preserving ancient texts, religious works, and classical literature, often spending countless hours on a single page, their work a testament to patience and devotion. The scriptorium was often one of the few heated rooms in the monastery, given the delicate nature of ink and parchment. Around 9 a.m., the bell would ring again for terce, the fourth service, a brief pause in their labor for more prayer and scripture. Following terce, the community would gather for the High Mass, the central act of Catholic worship, celebrated daily. This was the most solemn and elaborate service, featuring chanting, readings, and the sacrament of the Eucharist. After Mass, typically around 12 p.m., noon, came the first and often only substantial meal of the day in the refectory. This was a simple, communal affair. Meals usually consisted of bread, vegetables, pulses, and sometimes fish or cheese. Meat was typically forbidden except for the very ill. The meal was eaten in silence, with one monk reading aloud from a religious text, ensuring that even this necessary bodily function was imbued with spiritual meaning. After the meal, a short period of rest or quiet reflection might be permitted before the resumption of duties. The afternoon brought two more services, sext around 3 p.m., marking the 9th hour of the Roman day, and none around 5 p.m. These continued the cycle of prayer and psalmody, breaking up the afternoon's work and pulling the monks back to their primary purpose. As evening approached, the monastery began to prepare for night. Vespers, or evening prayer, was recited as the sun began to set, around 6 p.m. This was often a particularly beautiful service, with hymns and psalms sung in the fading light, reflecting on the close of the day and anticipating the coming night. Finally, just before retiring for the night, around 7 p.m. or 8 p.m., came Compline, the last service of the day. This was a short, somber service, a final prayer before sleep, with psalms and hymns of protection against the darkness and temptations of the night. The monks would then proceed in silence back to the dormitory. This period of great silence would last until after lauds the following morning, broken only by essential communication. Sleep was short and often interrupted, the cycle beginning anew with the pre-dawn clang of the bells. This relentless schedule, devoid of personal comfort or worldly distractions, was not designed for ease but for the purification of the soul. It was a life lived in constant awareness of God, a testament to the profound spiritual devotion that defined the existence of medieval monks, separating them from the bustling towns and muddy farms, living a life more ancient than the lands they guarded, all within the silent, hallowed confines of their cloistered walls. Silence in the medieval monastery was not merely preferred, it was sacred. It was not an absence of sound, but a profound presence, a tangible force that permeated every stone and shadow within the cloistered walls. For the monk, silence was an essential tool for spiritual discipline, a pathway to deeper communion with God, and a bulwark against the distractions and temptations of the secular world they had forsaken. Entire days, weeks, even months could pass without the exchange of a single spoken word among the brethren, save for the necessities of prayer and communal duties. The emphasis on silence, known as silentium or taciturnitatis, was deeply embedded in the very fabric of monastic rules, most prominently the rule of Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict himself understood the human inclination towards idle chatter, gossip, and the myriad distractions that everyday conversation could bring. He viewed such speech as a potential gateway to sin, a dispersion of the mind from its true focus, God. Therefore, the monastic ideal was to cultivate an interior stillness that mirrored the exterior quietude. The period of great silence, magnum silentium, was the most stringent application of this rule, typically enforced from Compline, the last service of the day, until after lauds, the morning prayer, the following day. During these hours, absolute quiet was maintained. Monks moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled by habit and intention. Even during the day, specific areas of the monastery were designated as silent zones: the dormitory, the refectory, dining hall, the cloisters, and especially the scriptorium. In the refectory, meals were taken in complete silence. The only sound was the clinking of wooden bowls and spoons, and the steady, disembodied voice of a designated reader who would intone passages from scripture, the lives of saints, or theological texts. This ensured that even the most basic bodily function was elevated to a spiritual exercise, preventing the trivial chatter that often accompanies meals in the outside world and fostering a meditative atmosphere. The scriptorium, the heart of intellectual labor in the monastery, was another bastion of silence. Here, the painstaking work of copying manuscripts demanded absolute concentration. The scratching of quills on parchment, the rustle of pages, the soft hum of concentration, these were the only permitted sounds. Any spoken word would break the intense focus required for such delicate and crucial work, where a single misplaced stroke or miscopied letter could corrupt a sacred text. Within the cloisters, the enclosed walkways surrounding the central garden, monks would often walk in quiet contemplation, their minds focused on prayer or study. The very architecture of the monastery, with its thick stone walls and secluded courtyards, reinforced this culture of quietude, creating a buffered space from the cacophony of the world. For the monk, silence was not a punishment but a profound opportunity. It forced an introspection that modern life rarely affords. Without the constant chatter of external voices, the internal voice became clearer. It was in this internal space that spiritual battles were fought and won, where insights into scripture were gained, and where a monk felt closest to the divine. This deep quiet allowed the monk to hear the still, small voice of God, unadulterated by worldly clamor. Communication among the brethren, when absolutely necessary, often relied on a system of monastic sign language. This wasn't a formal, universal language like modern sign languages, but rather a collection of practical gestures for common needs: a hand to the mouth to signify hunger, a pointing finger to indicate a book, a gesture for bread or water. These signs were functional, designed to convey information without breaking the sacred silence. It was a testament to the monks' commitment that they would resort to such methods rather than utter an unnecessary word. The strictness of the silence varied between different monastic orders and even between individual monasteries. Some orders, like the Cistercians, were particularly rigorous in their observance, extending the great silence for much of the day. Others, like the Carthusians, took it to an extreme, with monks living largely solitary lives in individual cells, coming together only for communal prayer, and speaking even then only when absolutely required by the liturgy. For Carthusian monks, spoken communication with their brethren might be limited to a single communal meal per week, and even then, conversations were often brief and focused on spiritual matters. This level of isolation was extraordinary, pushing the boundaries of human interaction to its spiritual limits. This pervasive culture of silence fostered a unique bond among the monks. Without the ease of casual conversation, interactions became more deliberate, more profound. Eyes communicated what lips could not: shared understanding, quiet sympathy, even unspoken amusement. A subtle nod, a shared glance, a gesture of assistance, these became powerful forms of communication, building a different kind of camaraderie rooted in shared purpose and mutual respect for the sacred. Quiet. However, this enforced silence also carried its own weight. For those not accustomed to it, or for those grappling with internal struggles, the silence could be crushing, magnifying anxieties and temptations. It was a severe test of mental fortitude and spiritual resilience. The monk learned to confront their own thoughts, their own demons, without the distraction of external voices. For some, this led to profound spiritual growth; for others, it could be a source of immense internal pressure. In essence, monastic silence was a deliberate, spiritual technology. It was a training ground for the soul, a discipline that cultivated attentiveness, humility, and a constant awareness of God's presence. It was the fertile ground in which prayer could deepen, contemplation could flourish, and the individual monk could undergo a profound transformation. Far from being an empty void, the silence within those ancient, cloistered walls was a vibrant, living space, a sacred echo chamber where the human spirit sought and sometimes found its most profound connection to the divine. For the medieval monk, life was a carefully orchestrated symphony of devotion, a relentless rhythm dictated not by personal inclination or the changing seasons of the outside world, but by the immutable will of God. Their existence was a stark counterpoint to the chaotic, unpredictable lives of peasants and lords. Time, that fleeting human construct, was for them a divine calculus, meticulously divided into strict segments: prayer, labor, study, more prayer. The hours were marked by the solemn toll of bells, not by the ebb and flow of human feelings. Indeed, time itself belonged to God, not to man. This profound commitment to time's consecration was the bedrock of the Benedictine rule, the spiritual charter that shaped countless monastic communities across Europe. Saint Benedict understood that disciplined use of time was essential for spiritual growth, preventing idleness, which he called the enemy of the soul, and fostering a constant awareness of God's presence. Every moment, from the deepest hours of the night to the fading light of dusk, was an opportunity for spiritual exercise. The day began in profound darkness, long before the sun even hinted at its ascent. The first bell, a deep, resonant clang that cut through the silent, cold stone of the dormitory, typically sounded around 2 a.m. This was the call to matins, or vigils, the longest and most demanding service of the divine office. Monks would rise from their hard pallets, pull on their rough wool habits, and shuffle silently through the unheated corridors to the abbey church. Here, for an hour or more, they would engage in a demanding spiritual vigil, chanting psalms, reciting prayers, listening to readings from scripture and the church fathers. It was a rigorous test of endurance, a battle against sleep and distraction, designed to purify the soul through unwavering focus on the divine. Following matins, there might be a short period for quiet personal prayer or even a brief, precious return to sleep before the next summons. But soon enough, as the first hint of gray light appeared in the sky, usually around 5 a.m., the bells would ring again for lauds, or morning prayer. This service marked the formal breaking of the day, a new beginning consecrated with hymns of praise and thanksgiving, anticipating the rising sun. With the dawn came the practical necessities of communal living. After lauds, the monks would gather in the chapter house. This was the administrative and spiritual heart of the monastery beyond the church. Here, the abbot, the spiritual father of the community, would read a chapter from the Rule of Saint Benedict, offering guidance and correction. Daily duties were assigned, minor transgressions confessed, and communal matters discussed. This ensured order and discipline, reinforcing the shared purpose of the monastic life. Then came prime, around 6 a.m., a shorter service to mark the first hour of daylight and invoke God's blessing on the day's tasks. After prime, the monks turned to their labor. This was a fundamental pillar of monastic life, the practical counterpoint to their fervent prayer. Monks were not idle contemplatives, they were diligent workers. Some would head to the monastery's fields, tilling the soil, sowing seeds, or harvesting crops that fed the community. Others worked in the monastery's gardens, cultivating vegetables, herbs for medicine, and perhaps vines for wine. Within the abbey walls, specialized labor was crucial. Monks might work in the kitchens, preparing the simple, often meat-free, communal meals. Others labored in the brewery, producing ale or wine, or in workshops making candles, clothing, or repairing tools. The more learned were often found in the scriptorium, a room typically kept silent and sometimes one of the few heated spaces. Here, illuminated by natural light or flickering lamps, scribes would meticulously copy manuscripts by hand, sacred texts, classical literature, and philosophical works. This painstaking work was not just labor, it was an act of profound dedication, preserving knowledge for future generations. The cycle of prayer continually punctuated their work. Around 9 a.m., the bells would call them to terce, a brief interlude for prayer before they returned to their duties. This constant interruption was intentional, preventing them from becoming too absorbed in their worldly tasks and reminding them that all work was ultimately for God. Following terce, the community would gather for the High Mass, the central act of Catholic worship, usually celebrated around 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. This was the most solemn and elaborate service of the day, featuring chant, readings, and the sacrament of the Eucharist. It was the spiritual climax of their morning, drawing the community together in profound devotion. After Mass, around 12 p.m., noon, came the first and often only substantial meal of the day, taken in the refectory. This was a silent affair, with one monk reading aloud from a spiritual text while the others ate their simple fare of bread, vegetables, and sometimes fish or cheese. The silence at meals reinforced the meditative atmosphere of the monastery, preventing idle chatter and encouraging internal reflection. A short period of rest or quiet reading might follow the meal. The afternoon brought two more services that broke up any resumed labor, sext around 3 p.m., and none around 5 p.m. These continued the cycle of prayer, ensuring that the monks were never too far from their primary spiritual purpose, always returning their minds to God. As the day began to draw to a close, around 6 p.m., the monks would gather for vespers, or evening prayer. This service, often sung as the sun set, held a reflective quality, offering thanksgiving for the day's blessings and preparing the soul for the approaching night. It was a beautiful transition, as daylight faded and the interior lamps began to glow. Finally, just before retiring for the night, around 7 p.m. or 8 p.m., came Compline, the last service of the day. This was a short, solemn prayer for protection against the darkness and the temptations of the night, a final act of devotion before the great silence descended upon the monastery. Monks would return to their cells in absolute quiet, and no unnecessary word would be spoken until after lauds the following morning. Sleep was brief and often interrupted, serving only to refresh them enough for the rigorous schedule to begin anew. This meticulously planned existence, driven by the ceaseless ringing of bells and the unwavering commitment to a divine timetable, shaped the very soul of the medieval monk. It was a life where personal feelings yielded to sacred duty, and every moment, every breath, every act of labor or study was a profound offering, testifying that for them, time itself was not a possession, but a perpetual, holy gift to God. The flickering glow of a single candle cast dancing shadows across the worn parchment. In the monastic scriptorium, a room often unheated save for the shared warmth of several bodies and the meager flames of beeswax, Brother Alaric bent over his desk. His quill, painstakingly sharpened from a goose feather, hovered above the vellum, poised to replicate the intricate script of the ancient text before him. This was the heart of monastic study and labor, a silent, relentless process that defined centuries of knowledge preservation, the copying of ancient texts by hand. For hours, sometimes days, without true rest, the scribes toiled. Their lives were a testament to meticulous precision and unwavering dedication. Eyes, already strained by countless hours of deciphering minute script in inadequate light, would burn and ache, often leading to debilitating vision problems in later life. Hands, cramped from gripping the quill with precise control, developed calluses and tremors. The monk's back, hunched over an angled desk designed to optimize ink flow, became permanently curved, a physical manifestation of his relentless devotion. Yet, each letter had to be perfect. For a medieval monk, particularly when copying sacred scripture, even a single mistake was not merely an error, it was thought to offend the divine, to corrupt the holy word, and to imperil the souls of those who would later read it. The process of creating a manuscript was arduous from its very inception. It began not in the scriptorium, but often in the fields, where animals, calves, goats, sheep, were raised for their skins. These hides were then transformed into vellum or parchment through a laborious process of soaking, scraping, stretching, and drying. The finished material, smooth and creamy, was expensive and precious, each sheet representing a significant investment of time and resources. Once prepared, the parchment had to be meticulously ruled with faint lines, guiding the scribe to maintain uniform margins, straight lines of text, and consistent letter height. The ink itself was a painstaking creation, often concocted from gallnuts, iron salts, and gum arabic, brewed and mixed to a specific consistency that would flow smoothly from the quill and adhere permanently to the vellum. Colors for rubrication, red headings or initial letters, and illumination, decorative borders and miniature illustrations, were ground from minerals, plants, and even precious metals like gold leaf, demanding a separate set of skills and even more intense focus. Within the scriptorium, silence was absolute, broken only by the scratching of quills, the rustle of pages, and the occasional soft clearing of a throat. Distraction was the enemy of accuracy. Monks often worked from an exemplar, the master copy, propped up beside their own nascent manuscript. Their gaze would flit back and forth, word by word, sometimes letter by letter, ensuring faithful reproduction. The pace was slow, agonizingly so. A skilled scribe might complete only a few pages in a day, and a large Bible or theological treatise could take months, even years, to complete. Some particularly prolific monks were even granted exemptions from certain communal duties to allow them more time at their desks, a testament to the value placed on their unique skill. The potential for error was ever present. A momentary lapse in concentration, an ink blot, a misread abbreviation, or a physical tremor could mar hours of work. While a skilled scribe could carefully scrape away dried ink with a penknife and correct a mistake, the process was delicate and risked damaging the precious parchment. More significant errors, like omitted words or lines, could persist and be unknowingly replicated in subsequent copies, creating a lineage of textual variations. This understanding fueled the almost obsessive pursuit of perfection. Scribes would often include colophons, short notes at the end of a text, begging readers to forgive any errors, acknowledging their human fallibility, and sometimes even invoking divine curses on anyone who might intentionally defile their work. Beyond the physical toll, the mental demands were immense. The repetitive nature of the work, coupled with the long hours and often cold, isolated conditions, could lead to a spiritual and psychological affliction known as aesthesia. This noonday demon manifested as a deep apathy, restlessness, and a profound sense of hopelessness, a spiritual weariness that made the hours drag interminably. Yet, the monk persevered, fueled by a sense of sacred duty. They saw their work as a form of prayer, a means of engaging directly with God's word and contributing to the salvation of humanity by making knowledge accessible. The work of these monastic scribes was not just an act of piety, it was the backbone of medieval intellectual life. In an age before the printing press, they were the custodians of knowledge, the living libraries that preserved not only the Bible and liturgical texts, but also the works of classical antiquity, philosophy, history, science, and literature, that would otherwise have been lost to the ravages of time. Without their tireless, painstaking efforts, the intellectual inheritance of Greece and Rome, and the theological foundations of Western Christianity, might never have survived the turbulent early Middle Ages. So, when one pictures the medieval monk, it is not just the image of prayer or humble labor. It is also the image of the solitary figure bent over a desk, a flickering candle illuminating his straining eyes and cramped hand, meticulously tracing each letter. It is the image of unwavering commitment to a sacred task, a testament to the belief that the perfect reproduction of a text was not just a craft, but a profound act of faith, a dedication to a divine order that permeated every stroke of the quill and every word on the page. In their silent, secluded scriptoria, these monks built, letter by perfect letter, the very foundations of Western civilization. The popular image of the medieval monastery is one of unblemished piety, of men dedicated solely to the sacred word, copying Bibles and theological treatises with unwavering devotion. And largely, this image holds true. Yet, within the vast, echoing silence of those venerable scriptoria and the dust-laden shelves of their libraries, a profound paradox often existed. For not all the texts were holy. Hidden among scriptures, nestled between commentaries on patristic writings and the lives of saints, were strange books, treatises on astrology, practical guides to medicine, curious interpretations of dreams, and even, on rare and clandestine occasions, unsettling tomes on magic. This was forbidden knowledge, preserved by the very men sworn to suppress it. The presence of such texts within monastic collections was not necessarily an act of rebellion, but a complex interplay of practicality, intellectual curiosity, and the sheer historical happenstance of preservation. Monasteries, as the primary centers of literacy and learning in a largely illiterate age, became the default custodians of all written knowledge that survived the collapse of the Roman Empire and the subsequent turmoil of the early Middle Ages. When a monastic library was established or expanded, it often acquired entire collections, some of which predated Christian dominance or contained secular, even pagan, wisdom that the Church later deemed problematic. Medicine, for instance, presented a nuanced case. While many ailments were attributed to divine will or demonic influence, monks, particularly those with a background in healing or a practical need to care for their ailing brethren, understood the value of empirical knowledge. Texts on herbalism, anatomy, however rudimentary, and ancient medical theories, often derived from Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, whose works survived primarily through monastic copies, were invaluable. While the Church discouraged practices deemed superstitious, practical healing was seen as a charitable act. So, a monastic library might contain texts describing the preparation of poultices from esoteric plants, or instructions for bloodletting according to astrological signs, practices that blurred the lines between accepted medicine and folk remedies, or even mild forms of sympathetic magic. Astrology was a particularly contentious subject. The Church condemned judicial astrology, predicting the future or a person's fate based on celestial positions, as a pagan practice that denied free will and usurped God's sole power. Yet, descriptive astrology, which merely observed planetary movements and their perceived influence on natural phenomena, like tides or the growth of crops, was often tolerated. Furthermore, the study of astronomy, essential for calculating the correct dates for Easter and other feast days, inevitably involved observing the heavens. Thus, monastic libraries often housed astronomical tables and even astrological treatises, sometimes with marginal notes by monks attempting to reconcile these sciences with Christian doctrine, or perhaps simply indulging a forbidden intellectual curiosity. These books, though potentially dangerous to the soul, held fascinating insights into the workings of the cosmos as understood by the ancients. The realm of dreams was another gray area. While many monks interpreted dreams through a spiritual lens, as divine messages, warnings, or demonic temptations, there were also ancient traditions of dream interpretation, often rooted in pagan or pre-Christian beliefs. Books on oniromancy, the art of dream interpretation, could be found, offering detailed symbolisms that might seem uncomfortably close to divination, a practice strictly forbidden by the Church. Their presence suggests that monks, wrestling with their own subconscious and seeking meaning in their nightly visions, might have sought guidance in these less orthodox texts. And then there was magic. This was the most explicitly condemned category of knowledge. The Church waged a constant war against sorcery, witchcraft, and all forms of demonic invocation. Yet, paradoxically, some monasteries held texts that detailed magical rituals, incantations, or alchemical processes that bordered on the occult. How did these come to be preserved? Sometimes, they were acquired by confiscation, brought in by converts from paganism, or simply inherited as part of larger collections without proper scrutiny. A monastery might possess a grimoire not to practice its contents, but to study and understand the enemy, to better preach against its evils. However, the very act of copying such texts, even for scholarly condemnation, ensured their survival and, inevitably, the risk of their contents being secretly absorbed or even attempted by curious or desperate monks. The truth was that medieval monks were not monolithic in their beliefs or intellectual pursuits. Among the thousands of devout, obedient brethren, there were also scholars with insatiable curiosities, rebels with heterodox inclinations, and practical men seeking solutions to worldly problems through whatever means available. A quiet, unassuming monk painstakingly copying a liturgical text might, by night, be poring over a hidden manuscript detailing the properties of a mandrake root, or charting a horoscope for a local lord, or even attempting to decipher an alchemical formula whispered to turn base metals into gold, or perhaps, achieve spiritual transmutation. The preservation of this forbidden knowledge by those sworn to suppress it highlights the complex intellectual landscape of the Middle Ages. Monasteries were not just spiritual refuges, they were often intellectual powerhouses, repositories of a vast and eclectic range of human thought. The thick, unyielding walls that kept the outside world at bay also inadvertently created a secure vault for ideas that might otherwise have vanished. The monks, with their disciplined copying habits and their unparalleled access to ancient texts, became inadvertent guardians of heresies, superstitions, and secular wisdom that lay far outside the approved canon. These hidden libraries represented a tension between spiritual doctrine and intellectual thirst, between condemnation and preservation. They serve as a powerful reminder that behind the plain robes and shaven heads, within the cloistered walls where silence was sacred and time belonged to God, a vibrant, sometimes dangerous, intellectual underworld secretly thrived, preserving mysteries that continue to intrigue and challenge our understanding of the medieval world. The whisper of forbidden knowledge, like a persistent echo, resonated through the very halls designed to silence it. The monastic gardens were more than just sources of sustenance or quiet places for contemplation. Nestled behind tall stone walls, often shielded from casual view, these plots flourished with a bewildering array of plants. Many were common vegetables and culinary herbs, but a significant section, often known as the physic garden or herbularius, was dedicated to plants with potent medicinal properties. Here, amid the fragrant rosemary and pungent wormwood, some monks practiced herbal medicine, brewing tonics and tinctures in shadowed apothecaries, their knowledge a silent power behind the scenes. This medical practice was a complex blend of ancient wisdom, empirical observation, and a touch of the mystical. Monasteries, as centers of learning, had preserved many classical medical texts from Greek and Roman antiquity, works by Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides de Materia Medica. These foundational texts, painstakingly copied in the scriptorium, formed the theoretical basis of monastic healing. But this was augmented by generations of practical experience within the monastery walls. Monks observed the effects of various plants on ailments, refining remedies through trial and error, often passing down recipes and knowledge verbally or in small, practical notebooks. The monks understood the doctrine of signatures, a belief that plants revealed their medicinal purpose through their appearance, a liver-shaped leaf for liver ailments, a yellow flower for jaundice. While dismissed by modern science, this system guided many of their early experiments and often correlated with actual medicinal properties. They would collect herbs at specific times of day or lunar cycles, believing these factors influenced the plant's potency. Roots were dug in autumn, leaves gathered in spring, and flowers at their peak bloom. In their monastic infirmaries, the monks served as the primary caregivers for their community. They treated their ailing brethren for a wide range of common medieval afflictions, fevers, coughs, stomach upsets, wounds, and skin conditions. They would prepare soothing teas from chamomile for indigestion, apply poultices of comfrey to broken bones, use mint for headaches, and administer willow bark, containing salicylates, the precursor to aspirin, for pain and inflammation. Monasteries often had dedicated infirmers, monks whose primary duty was the care of the sick, and who became highly skilled in the preparation and application of these herbal remedies. But their healing extended beyond the cloistered walls. Monasteries were often magnets for the outside world, especially in remote areas where trained physicians were scarce. They healed villagers, both rich and poor, who would trek to the abbey gates seeking relief from suffering. A local peasant with a nagging cough, a merchant suffering from dysentery, or a child with a festering wound might all find succor and a carefully prepared herbal remedy from the monks. This act of charity was a vital expression of their Christian faith, solidifying the monastery's role as a beacon of hope and practical assistance in a harsh world. The monks' perceived piety often enhanced the efficacy of their treatments, as people believed that God's blessing surely accompanied the remedies offered by his devout servants. However, the very knowledge that allowed them to heal also conferred a more sinister, silent power. They could sometimes poison nobles. While certainly not a common practice, the intimate understanding of plant properties meant that certain monks possessed knowledge of highly toxic flora. Plants like monkshood, aconite, hemlock, henbane, and deadly nightshade, all grown for their medicinal applications in carefully controlled quantities, e.g., as sedatives, pain relievers, or in minute doses for specific conditions, were also potent poisons. The line between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one could be incredibly fine, requiring immense precision and knowledge to navigate. In a world rife with political intrigue, power struggles, and few reliable methods of detection, a silent death by poison was a tempting, if terrifying, solution for those seeking to remove rivals or enemies. While direct evidence of monks systematically poisoning nobles is rare and often shrouded in rumor and accusation rather than proven fact, the capacity for such acts cannot be entirely dismissed. A disgruntled monk, perhaps acting on behalf of a powerful external faction, or driven by a corrupted sense of justice, could theoretically leverage his unique botanical expertise. A seemingly innocent herbal tonic, if subtly altered with a concentrated extract of a toxic plant, could bring about a slow, agonizing decline or a sudden, fatal collapse that would be difficult to trace in an era without forensic science. Such acts, if they occurred, would have been deeply antithetical to the monastic vows and the Christian ideal of healing. Yet, the very secrecy and self-sufficiency of the monastic community, coupled with their specialized knowledge, would have provided a perfect veil for such dark deeds. A silent power, indeed. It was a testament to the dual nature of knowledge itself, a tool for immense good, but also, in the wrong hands, a weapon of silent destruction. The peaceful, shadowed gardens, with their orderly beds of healing herbs, therefore harbored not only the promise of life and comfort but also, potentially, the silent threat of a carefully administered death, making the monk an unlikely, yet formidable, player in the hidden dramas of the medieval age. The solemn hymns and hushed footsteps of the monks echoed through the abbey's upper chambers, painting a picture of devout tranquility. Yet, deep beneath certain monasteries, a different kind of silence reigned, a silence laden with chill and ancient secrets. Here, the very air seemed to press down, heavy with the weight of centuries. These were the vaults and crypts, cold, echoing rooms carved out of the earth or built into the foundations, where relics, bones, and sometimes darker, more unsettling things were stored. These were places even monks, for all their piety and courage, feared to enter alone. Monasteries were not merely places of worship and study, they were also repositories. In a world where holiness often manifested in physical form, relics were paramount. A fragment of a saint's bone, a piece of their clothing, a sliver of the true cross, or even a vial of holy oil, these were considered conduits to divine power, capable of miracles, healing, and offering spiritual protection. The more prestigious the relic, the greater the fame and fortune it brought to the monastery. Such treasures required absolute security. Thus, deep vaults, often labyrinthine and accessible only through hidden passages or heavily fortified doors, became their sacred strongboxes. These were not just storage rooms, they were sanctuaries within sanctuaries, their entrances frequently disguised or deliberately made inconspicuous, sometimes only known to the abbot and a few trusted senior monks. The atmosphere in these subterranean chambers was distinct. Unlike the bright, airy spaces of the church or the communal warmth of the refectory, the vaults were perpetually dim, even when illuminated by the flickering light of a torch. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and aged stone. Here, silence was not just a discipline, but an inherent quality of the space, magnifying every creak, every drip of water, every nervous breath. Beyond the glistening reliquaries, these vaults often housed bones. Not just the bones of revered saints, carefully displayed in ornate containers, but often the remains of countless generations of monks themselves. Crypts served as burial chambers, layer upon layer of interred brethren returning to the earth beneath the very ground they had consecrated with their lives. The presence of so much death, though accepted as a natural part of existence and a step towards resurrection, could nonetheless be profoundly unsettling. The sheer weight of mortality, the accumulated spirits of the departed, seemed to press in on anyone venturing into those depths. Ossuaries, where disinterred bones were neatly stacked, were not uncommon, a stark memento mori designed to remind the living of their fleeting existence. But occasionally, in the deepest, most shadowed recesses, or darker things. These were not necessarily malevolent entities, but objects or secrets that the monastery, for various reasons, deemed too dangerous or too sensitive for the light of day. This could range from forbidden texts and heretical manuscripts. As explored previously, monasteries sometimes acquired or preserved books deemed heretical, pagan, or overtly magical. Rather than destroy them outright, which might be seen as destroying knowledge, and potentially provoking the ire of unseen forces associated with the texts, they were often locked away in the deepest vaults. This served to contain their dangerous influence, preventing unauthorized access while still theoretically preserving them. The knowledge contained within these pages might be of ancient rituals, forgotten deities, blasphemous philosophies, or dark alchemical formulas. Merely knowing of their existence, let alone confronting their contents, could shake a monk's faith. Confiscated occult artifacts. When the church condemned local pagan practices or encountered individuals engaged in sorcery, any discovered artifacts, amulets, charms, strange idols, or implements used in dark rituals, might be brought to the nearest monastery for safe, secure containment. Rather than destroy them, risking a backlash or releasing malevolent spirits, they were often simply entombed in the deepest vaults, their perceived power neutralized by the sacred ground and constant prayer above. Secrets of the order. Some monasteries held secrets pertaining to their own history or the wider church that could undermine faith or authority if revealed. This might include evidence of past scandals, a schism or heresy within their own ranks, documents detailing unholy alliances, or the true, less miraculous origins of a particularly potent relic. These would be locked away, often in a small, concealed chamber within the larger vault, their existence known only to the abbot and perhaps his closest, most trusted confidants. The weight of such hidden truths could be a heavy burden. Unusual or unexplained remains. Beyond the saintly relics and common burials, there might be anomalous bones or strange artifacts whose origins were unknown or unsettling. Perhaps the remains of a creature thought mythical, or human bones showing inexplicable deformities, or even archaeological finds from pre-Christian eras that challenged prevailing theological understanding. These would be stored not out of veneration, but out of a mixture of curiosity, fear, and a desire to control potentially unsettling information. Entering these subterranean spaces was often a rite, a task entrusted only to those with the strongest faith and constitution. The cold, echoing silence, the palpable sense of ancient presences, the faint, earthy smell, and the knowledge of what lay within, relics radiating centuries of devotion, but also the potential for something far older and more unsettling, made it a place where courage often faltered. The flickering light of a single torch would only deepen the shadows, conjuring unsettling shapes from the piles of ancient stones and the dust-shrouded containers. These vaults represented the monastery's unconscious, its hidden depths where faith and fear, the sacred and the profane, past and present, converged. They were tangible reminders that even within the most ordered and pious institutions, there were chambers where the light of God's grace seemed to struggle, and where the enduring mysteries of human belief, and human darkness, were kept under lock and key. It was a silent power, held by the abbots who controlled access, and a chilling reminder that even the most holy institutions often guarded secrets far more complex than simple piety. The thick stone walls of St. Augustine's Abbey, designed to keep the profane world out, also held its secrets in. Despite the rigid discipline of the rule, the endless cycle of prayer, and the sanctified silence, the human spirit, with all its glorious and terrifying capacity for the extraordinary, could not always be contained. Whispers passed between the monks, hushed tales shared in the brief, permitted moments before Compline, or murmured in the shadowed corners of the infirmary, of phenomena that defied explanation. Tales of brothers who saw visions, who levitated during prayer, or who disappeared into the ancient woods and returned, different. The most common, and often celebrated, of these occurrences were the visions. In a community so utterly devoted to the spiritual, ecstatic experiences were not just possible but, in some cases, actively sought or interpreted as signs of divine favor. A monk, deep in contemplation during matins, might suddenly see the Virgin Mary bathed in celestial light, or witness a profound biblical scene unfold before his inner eye. Brother Damien, a frail man known for his unwavering piety, was said to have conversed directly with Saint Benedict himself, receiving guidance for the abbey's continued prosperity. These visions, when shared, were typically treated with reverence, carefully documented by the abbot, and seen as proof of God's direct intervention in their holy lives. They fueled the faith of the community, reinforcing the sacred purpose of their arduous existence. But even visions carried a subtle, unsettling edge. How could one discern divine revelation from a fevered dream, or worse, a demonic deception? The line was often thin, the discernment left to the wisdom of the abbot, whose judgment was not always infallible. Far rarer, and infinitely more bewildering, were the accounts of levitation during prayer. Brother Malachi, a heavy-set man renowned for his earthly practicality, was one such whispered example. During a particularly fervent session of communal prayer, several brethren claimed to have seen him, not once but thrice, rise gently from his knees, hovering inches above the cold stone floor of the choir stalls. His face, they described, was a mask of serene ecstasy, utterly oblivious to his own defying of natural law. Such events were astounding, immediately attributed to the most profound state of grace, a direct manifestation of God's power acting through his humble servant. Yet, they also bred a quiet awe mixed with a touch of fear. To witness such a blatant miracle, to see a brother transcend the physical realm, was to confront the terrifying power of the divine in a way that resonated far beyond the comfort of liturgy. It implicitly questioned the solidity of their own existence, a fleeting glimpse into a reality where the physical laws they understood simply did not apply. These tales were often suppressed or rarely spoken of outside a trusted few, as they could attract unwanted attention from the secular world or even the suspicious gaze of church inquisitors, wary of anything too overtly miraculous. But the most chilling whispers, the ones that sent shivers through the dormitory at night and made monks pull their habits tighter around them, concerned those who disappeared into the ancient woods and returned, different. The woods surrounding St. Augustine's Abbey were vast and ancient, a tangled wilderness of gnarled oaks and shadowed ravines. They were a source of timber, herbs, and occasionally wild game, but also a place of dread and superstition for the local villagers. For the monks, the woods were a place of spiritual retreat for solitary contemplation, or sometimes, a necessary evil for foraging. Brother Elian, a quiet, scholarly man with a gentle demeanor, was the first they spoke of in such hushed tones. He had ventured into the Blackwood one damp autumn morning to collect medicinal herbs for the infirmary. He was gone for 3 days. Search parties found no trace. The abbot had begun the prayers for the dead when, on the 4th morning, Elian reappeared at the abbey gates. He was unharmed, his robes only slightly torn, but his eyes were no longer the gentle, thoughtful gaze they remembered. They held a disturbing emptiness, a profound, chilling stillness. He spoke little, performing his duties mechanically, but he never met another monk's gaze directly. He ate less, slept less, and when he did sleep, the novices whispered of strange, guttural sounds emanating from his cell. He would spend hours staring blankly at the wall, and sometimes, a faint, earthy smell, like damp soil and something wild, seemed to cling to him. He was present, yet profoundly absent, a vessel inhabited by something else. Then there was Brother Finian, a robust and jovial monk, who disappeared during a harsh winter. He too returned days later, gaunt and shivering, his body bearing no marks of injury or frostbite despite the biting cold. But Finian, once a man of booming laughter and hearty appetite, became withdrawn, his voice a rasping whisper. He would shun the warmth of the common room, preferring to sit alone in the coldest parts of the cloister, often gazing out into the dark woods with an unsettling longing in his eyes. He stopped participating in the communal chants, his voice a silent void among the brethren. Occasionally, he would murmur in a language no one understood, ancient sounds that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the abbey. The change was so profound, so absolute, that the other monks instinctively shied away, their pity quickly replaced by an unshakable dread. These were the stories that haunted the quiet hours, tales that the abbot, with stern words about demonic influence or trials of faith, sought to quell. Yet, the unsettling truth of a brother who walked amongst them, yet was clearly no longer fully them, lingered. What happened in those ancient woods? What entities or forces lurked within their shadows that could so fundamentally alter a man's spirit, leaving his body intact but his essence strangely diminished or subtly twisted? Was it a malevolent spirit, a lingering pagan magic, or something else entirely, beyond human comprehension? These occurrences, whether divine grace or chilling transformation, served as a constant, unsettling reminder that even within the most rigorous and pious institutions, the boundaries between the known and the unknown, the holy and the profane, were sometimes terrifyingly thin. They were the silent cracks in the abbey's sanctity, through which the untamed mysteries of the world, and perhaps the soul, could bleed into the cloistered quiet. In the venerable libraries of St. Augustine's Abbey, among the endless rows of saints' lives, theological commentaries, and painstakingly copied scriptures, lay a hidden truth known only to a select few. Beyond the illuminated Gospels and the dusty treatises on rhetoric, a more sinister category of knowledge resided, books no one was allowed to read. These were not merely rare or valuable texts, they were forbidden, their very existence a secret, their contents guarded by iron and an unspoken dread. These were the chained books, not just secured to their shelves to prevent theft as was common in many medieval libraries, but bound in thick, often unmarked leather, and truly locked with chains, sometimes even clasps of intricate design that required a specific key known only to the abbot or the most senior librarian. These were not meant for casual perusal, nor for any monk save those with a specific, often unspoken, mandate. They were artifacts of knowledge too dangerous, too potent, or too blasphemous for open eyes. What lay within these carefully guarded tomes? They held diagrams, intricate and unsettling, depicting celestial alignments that bordered on forbidden astrology, or geometric patterns that hinted at occult numerology. There were symbols, arcane and unsettling, alien to Christian iconography, possibly derived from forgotten pagan cults, ancient Hermetic traditions, or even whispered lore from the distant East. And most certainly, they contained secrets, forgotten histories, blasphemous philosophies, alchemical formulae for transmuting not just metals but perhaps even the human soul, or, most terrifyingly, invocations and rituals for communicating with entities best left undisturbed. The creation of such books within monastic walls presented a profound paradox. Why would men sworn to God's service, dedicated to the preservation of Holy Scripture, engage in the transcription, and thus the preservation, of such dangerous material? The reasons were complex, often pragmatic, and sometimes unsettlingly human. Containment and knowledge of the enemy. Just as a monastery might house a confiscated pagan idol in its deepest vault, so too might it preserve a book of magic. The logic was that to effectively combat evil, one must understand it. To preach against heresy, one must know its arguments. These books were not copied for use, but for containment and study by a select few, acting as spiritual sentinels guarding against the encroachment of forbidden knowledge. A monk might painstakingly copy a grimoire not to practice its spells, but to analyze its demonic structures, to discern its weaknesses, or to understand the mind of the heretic. The lure of pure knowledge, even within the most pious hearts, there existed intellectual curiosity. The monastic scholar, having mastered Latin and Greek, having delved into Aristotle and Plato, might find himself drawn to the fringes of accepted knowledge. These forbidden texts, often survivors from late antiquity or brought from distant lands, represented unique insights, different ways of understanding the cosmos, power over nature, or the very fabric of existence. The temptation to preserve, and perhaps secretly study, such unique intellectual artifacts was immense, regardless of their spiritual peril. Historical preservation, accidental or intentional monasteries were the primary cultural preservers of the age. When entire libraries from fallen Roman villas or dissolved pagan temples came into their possession, these collections often included books on every conceivable subject. Rather than burn everything immediately, which itself might be a dangerous act, potentially unleashing the spirits associated with the texts. Problematic volumes might be simply locked away, preserved by default due to the monk's dedication to the written word. Over generations, the original context might be lost, leaving only a dangerous, unreadable artifact. Secret patronage or orders within orders. Less commonly, such books might be commissioned or maintained by powerful secular patrons who had a vested interest in their contents, and leveraged the monastery's security and scholarly resources. Or, as whispered in the deeper corners of the abbey, some monasteries harbored secret societies or orders within orders, cells of monks who pursued knowledge beyond the Benedictine rule. These might be the remnants of older, pre-Christian traditions, or newly formed groups seeking forbidden wisdom, perhaps even interpreting their spiritual quest through a heterodox, occult lens. For them, these books were not dangerous but sacred, holding keys to hidden powers or profound enlightenment. The act of copying such a book was itself a perilous undertaking. The scribe, sitting alone in the scriptorium, his quill scratching under the dim candlelight, would be exposed to its contents, page by page. He might read of alchemical processes to achieve the philosopher's stone, not just a means to gold but to eternal life, or intricate horoscopes predicting the fall of kingdoms, or the chilling names of demons and the precise incantations to summon them. The psychological toll could be immense: fear of damnation, moral conflict, the gnawing temptation to experiment, or the chilling sensation of unseen eyes watching him from the shadows. Perhaps this was why some monks disappeared into the woods and returned, different, their minds irrevocably altered by the forbidden knowledge they had transcribed. When not actively being studied, under extreme supervision, or copied, these books were sequestered in the deepest, most secure parts of the library, often in dedicated, hidden alcoves or within the subterranean vaults previously described. The chains were literal and symbolic, a physical barrier against access, and a spiritual warning against the insidious power contained within their pages. The very knowledge that they existed was often confined to the abbot and the most senior, trusted librarians, sworn to secrecy, their sacred duty to protect the community from the spiritual contagion these books represented. The existence of these chained and forbidden books reveals a powerful truth about medieval monasticism. It was not a monolith of pure, unblemished piety, but a complex human institution operating in a world grappling with ancient beliefs, burgeoning intellectual curiosities, and the enduring human fascination with the hidden and the powerful. The silence within the monastery walls may have seemed absolute, but in these chained volumes, one could almost hear the whispered echoes of ancient spells, forgotten philosophies, and secrets never meant for open eyes, forever preserved in the dark heart of the holiest institutions. Beyond the meticulous columns of sacred text, past the vibrant initial letters that blossomed with gold and color, lay a secret world. In the vast, echoing silence of the scriptorium, where pious monks toiled for hours, their eyes strained by candlelight, some created strange art in the margins of holy texts. Here, on the very edges of divine revelation, bloomed an unexpected menagerie, dancing skeletons, macabre and strangely whimsical, hybrid beasts, part human, part animal, contorted into impossible forms, and even more baffling, monks riding snails, their serene faces incongruously perched atop gastropod steeds. These were not sanctioned illustrations. They were not part of the grand scheme of an illuminated Bible or a majestic psalter. Instead, they were the whispered confessions, the private jokes, the desperate attempts to speak from souls bound by vows of silence and rigorous discipline. Were they jokes? Warnings? Or desperate attempts to speak? The answer, perhaps, is all three, and more. The margins of medieval manuscripts, technically known as marginalia, were a unique canvas. For the scribe or illuminator, the act of copying was often monotonous, mind-numbing labor. Hour after hour, letter after letter, the same words repeated, the same religious themes depicted. The margins offered a small, illicit freedom, a space where the rigorous control over the main text could be momentarily relaxed. Here, the artist's personal whims, anxieties, and observations of the world could playfully, or sometimes disturbingly, emerge. Consider the dancing skeletons. The medieval world was intimately familiar with death. Plagues, famines, and warfare were constant companions. The dance macabre, or dance of death, was a popular artistic motif, reminding all, from king to peasant, of the universality of death and the fleeting nature of earthly life. In the margins of a holy text, these dancing skeletons might serve as a powerful memento mori, a reminder to the reader, and perhaps to the artist himself, of mortality, urging deeper piety. Yet, their often playful, almost jaunty postures could also hint at a dark humor, a gallows wit that found absurdity even in the face of inevitable demise. Were they a warning against worldly vanity, or a subversive jab at the pompous prelates who commissioned these very texts? The hybrid beasts were even more perplexing. Part human, part animal, sometimes a combination of several creatures, a rabbit with a human head, a bird with human legs, a dragon with a monk's cowl. These were known as drolleries or grotesques. Some scholars believe these fantastical creatures were simply manifestations of a rich medieval imagination, inherited from classical myths or folk traditions. Others suggest they served a deeper purpose. They could symbolize the struggle between man's spiritual and animalistic nature, a visual representation of temptation or sin. A monk-like figure with ass's ears might symbolize foolishness or stubbornness, perhaps a gentle, self-deprecating jest by the artist about his own shortcomings or those of his brethren. They might also have functioned as a kind of visual, liminal space, occupying the boundary between the sacred text and the secular world, a release valve for the subconscious anxieties and observations of the monastic artist. And then there were the truly bizarre, monks riding snails. This is one of the most enduring and puzzling images in marginalia. What could it possibly mean? Several theories exist. Some suggest it's a simple visual pun or a joke at the expense of the slow, plodding pace of monastic life or the perceived slowness of a particular brother. Snails, with their shells, were sometimes associated with armor, so a monk fighting or riding a snail might be a humorous inversion of chivalric combat, or even a subtle critique of the militarization of certain monastic orders. Another theory posits that snails were seen as symbols of resurrection, emerging from their shells, or humility, always carrying their burdens. Perhaps it was a quiet, subversive commentary on monastic obedience, or a private joke shared only among those who understood the abbey's internal dynamics. The very absurdity of the image could also simply be an outlet for suppressed playfulness, a moment of unbridled imagination breaking through the rigid formality of their daily lives. These marginal creations were often deeply personal. They allowed the individual monk, whose identity was largely subsumed by the communal monastic life, a fleeting moment of self-expression. They could be a quiet form of protest, a subtle critique of authority, or a way to vent frustrations and boredom. The act of creating these unsanctioned images was itself a minor transgression, a small act of rebellion within a meticulously ordered world. It was a risk, as an abbot or master illuminator discovering them might view them as irreverent, distracting, or even heretical. Yet, they persisted, an undeniable testament to the human need for creativity and self-expression. Even in the most disciplined environments, these marginal figures also speak to the medieval worldview, which was far less rigidly compartmentalized than our own. The sacred and the profane, the serious and the absurd, often coexisted side by side. These drolleries were not necessarily seen as defiling the holy text, but rather as adding another layer of meaning, a visual commentary that might have been humorous, cautionary, or deeply personal to the monk who drew them. Ultimately, the strange art in the margins of holy texts remains a captivating mystery. We can interpret them, theorize about their meanings, and marvel at their ingenuity. But their true intent, the specific joke, warning, or desperate attempt to speak from the soul of a particular monk, remains largely locked within the centuries, an intimate whisper from the past, forever enshrined on the unsanctioned canvas of the holy page. They serve as a powerful reminder that even in the most austere and disciplined environments, the human spirit finds ways to dance, to question, and to express its most curious and profound truths. Amidst the solemn tolling of bells, the whispered prayers, and the laborious copying of ancient texts, another, more earthly, industry hummed quietly within the walls of many medieval monasteries, the brewery. Far from being a mere domestic chore, the brewing of beer was a highly skilled craft, a vital source of sustenance, and, for many abbeys, an engine of astonishing wealth. Monks brewed beer not just for themselves, to sustain their arduous daily lives, but for extensive trade. And through this amber liquid, some abbeys became rich, incredibly rich. Gold, silver, and vast material resources flowed through their cellars, even as the brethren themselves claimed to own nothing. The practice of brewing in monasteries dates back to the early Middle Ages. Beer was not merely a beverage. In an era where water sources were often contaminated and unsafe to drink, beer, with its boiling process during brewing, was a much safer and more nutritious alternative. It was a staple of the medieval diet, providing calories, vitamins, and hydration, particularly for those engaged in physical labor, which included most monks. Monasteries, with their large communities of resident monks, novices, lay brothers, and often a steady stream of pilgrims and guests, needed vast quantities of this fermented grain. The process itself was complex and required considerable infrastructure. Monasteries boasted dedicated brewhouses, equipped with large copper kettles, malting floors for barley, and cool cellars for fermentation and storage. The raw materials, barley, hops, yeast, and pure water, were often sourced from the abbey's own extensive lands, giving them control over the entire production chain. Monks became master brewers, passing down their techniques from generation to generation, perfecting recipes, and developing distinctive styles of ale and beer. Each monastery's brew often had a unique character, determined by its specific ingredients, water source, and brewing methods, making it a recognizable and sought-after product. Initially, beer production was primarily for internal consumption. Monks, by their rule, were permitted a certain allowance of beer daily, seeing it as a necessary fortifier for their demanding spiritual and physical routines. However, the monastic ideal of hospitality, one of Saint Benedict's core tenets, meant that visitors, pilgrims, and the poor who sought refuge at the abbey gates also needed sustenance. Soon, the surplus production, born out of efficiency and abundance from their vast agricultural holdings, found a ready market outside the walls. This is where the true economic power began to manifest. Monasteries were often self-sufficient economic units, possessing vast tracts of fertile land, forests, mills, and sometimes even mines. They produced not only beer but also wine, cheese, wool, and agricultural surplus. But beer, with its broad appeal and relatively long shelf life compared to fresh produce, became an incredibly lucrative commodity. Trade routes flourished around monastic breweries. Carts laden with barrels of monastic ale would depart the abbey gates, bound for nearby towns, castles, and markets. The quality and purity of monastic brews were often renowned, making them highly desirable. This wasn't a casual sideline. It was a professional, large-scale operation that rivaled, and sometimes surpassed, the production of secular brewers. The income generated was immense. Gold, silver, and other forms of currency flowed back into the abbey's coffers. This wealth, however, presented a unique paradox for the monks. Their vows explicitly demanded poverty. Individual monks owned nothing, their personal possessions were limited to their habit, a few books, and the most basic necessities. Yet, the community could become staggeringly wealthy. The income from beer sales, alongside revenues from land rents, tithes, and other monastic enterprises, allowed abbeys to become incredibly powerful economic players. This wealth was not, in theory, for personal enrichment. It was channeled back into the monastery and its mission. Construction and maintenance. Rich abbeys could build magnificent cathedrals, grand cloisters, and sprawling monastic complexes, structures that endure to this day. They maintained libraries, scriptoria, and infirmaries, all requiring substantial funds. Charity and social services. A portion of the wealth was theoretically dedicated to charity. Monasteries fed the poor, cared for the sick, and provided shelter for travelers. They often served as hospitals, orphanages, and schools for the local populace. Art and scholarship. The wealth enabled the patronage of artists, the purchase of rare books, and the meticulous creation of illuminated manuscripts, pushing the boundaries of medieval art and scholarship. Land acquisition and expansion. Profits were reinvested, allowing abbeys to acquire more land, build more mills, and expand their economic influence, further solidifying their power and ensuring future income streams. While the individual monk claimed to own nothing, living a life of apparent simplicity and self-denial, the communal wealth of the abbey could be truly astonishing. It allowed abbots to wield significant political power, acting as advisors to kings and nobles, holding sway over vast territories, and commanding armies of lay servants and even knights in some instances. The monastic ideal of withdrawal from the world often clashed with the very real worldly influence that their economic success afforded them. The brewing of beer, therefore, became a potent symbol of this monastic paradox. It was a humble, practical craft born of necessity and hospitality, yet it evolved into a sophisticated industry that funneled vast riches into institutions that outwardly espoused poverty. The clinking of coins in the abbot's strongbox, the bustling activity of trade wagons, and the rich aroma of fermenting hops told a tale of silent power and immense, understated wealth, fundamentally shaping the economic and political landscape of medieval Europe, all from within the supposedly austere walls of God's servants. The image of the humble monk, withdrawn from the world, is but one facet of the complex reality of medieval monasticism. As centuries unfolded, fueled by vast landholdings, burgeoning trade, like their renowned breweries, and an unparalleled monopoly on literacy and record-keeping, a different kind of power quietly, inexorably, grew. The spiritual authority of the crozier began to intertwine, sometimes seamlessly, sometimes contentiously, with the scepter of temporal rule. Indeed, some abbots were more powerful than kings. They commanded armies, advised rulers, and when it suited them, they rewrote history with their quills. This ascent to immense power was a gradual process, rooted in several key factors. Firstly, the spiritual authority of an abbot was immense. As the spiritual father of his community and a direct representative of God within his abbey, his pronouncements carried immense weight. This spiritual prestige often translated into secular influence. Nobles and commoners alike sought their counsel, believing that a man so close to God surely possessed wisdom beyond earthly measure. The sanctity of the monastery itself became a beacon, drawing donations of land and wealth from pious patrons seeking salvation or offering penance. Secondly, and crucially, was economic might. We've touched upon monastic breweries, but this was just one stream of immense revenue. Monasteries owned vast tracts of the most fertile agricultural land, managed extensive forests, ran mills, and often controlled strategic trade routes or river crossings. Their sheer scale of land ownership meant they often controlled entire villages, towns, and their populations, turning peasants into tenants beholden to the abbey. They were major employers, substantial landowners, and significant producers of goods, creating wealth that far outstripped many minor lords and even some nascent kingdoms. An abbot managing such an economic powerhouse was, by definition, a formidable temporal lord. Thirdly, and perhaps most subtly potent, was the monastic monopoly on knowledge and literacy. In a largely illiterate age, monks were the scholars, the record-keepers, and the chroniclers. They maintained archives, copied laws, drafted treaties, and, critically, wrote the histories. This intellectual power gave them an unparalleled influence over narratives and memory. Kings and nobles, many of whom were illiterate themselves, relied heavily on monastic scribes and administrators to manage their own realms, draft their correspondence, and record their decrees. This reliance often turned into dependence, giving abbots a direct pipeline to royal courts and a seat at the tables of power. This confluence of spiritual authority, economic power, and intellectual control allowed certain abbots to transcend their purely spiritual role. Figures like Suger of Saint Denis in France, or the powerful abbots of Cluny, wielded influence that stretched across kingdoms. They were not merely spiritual advisors, they were de facto statesmen. They commanded armies. While monks themselves rarely fought, though history records exceptions, their vast landholdings often came with feudal obligations. Vassals and tenants who owed military service to the abbey could be called upon to form a formidable fighting force, protecting monastic lands, suppressing local rebellions, or even joining royal campaigns. Some abbots, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire, held the status of prince-bishops or prince-abbots, exercising full temporal sovereignty over their territories, complete with courts, laws, and the right to raise and lead their own contingents of knights and soldiers. An abbot in full armor, leading his retinue to battle, might seem incongruous with the vows of peace, but it was a stark reality of medieval power. They advised rulers. Kings, often struggling to consolidate power, needed astute minds, moral authority, and administrative expertise. Abbots, with their education, their access to information, and their perceived impartiality, though this was often a facade, became indispensable counselors. They helped draft legislation, negotiate treaties, and settle disputes. Their monasteries often served as neutral ground for sensitive diplomatic meetings. An abbot's word could sway royal policy, influence succession, or even condemn an enemy, demonstrating a political acumen honed by managing vast estates and complex human communities. They were often crucial intermediaries between secular rulers and the Pope, adding another layer to their already formidable influence. And most chillingly, when it suited them, they rewrote history with their quills. Monasteries were the primary chroniclers of medieval events. The monastic annals, chronicles, and histories written in the scriptorium became the accepted narrative for future generations. This gave abbots and their scribes immense power. They could subtly emphasize certain events, downplay others, insert favorable interpretations of their own abbey's actions, or even omit inconvenient truths. A legal claim to land, a disputed succession, or a past controversy could be definitively shaped, or reshaped, by the meticulous, or deliberately selective, strokes of a monk's quill. A victory might be exaggerated, a defeat softened, a saintly lineage invented, or a rival subtly tarnished. The very concept of historical truth was often fluid, molded by the hand that held the pen, and that hand frequently belonged to a monk. This immense power did not come without its internal conflicts. The pursuit of temporal influence often clashed with the monastic ideal of spiritual purity and humility. Wealth could lead to corruption, political power to moral compromise, and the very act of commanding armies seemed far removed from the teachings of Christ. The reformers within the church frequently railed against the secularization of abbeys, calling for a return to the simplicity of the Benedictine rule. Yet, the allure of power was strong, and the practical necessities of defending monastic lands and asserting their rights in a turbulent age often seemed to justify these worldly engagements. Thus, the abbot, cloaked in the humble habit, holding the symbolic crozier, often held sway over realms far larger than any spiritual flock. He controlled not just souls, but lands, serfs, gold, and the very narrative of his age. The quiet halls of the monastery, seemingly removed from the clamor of the world, were, in reality, often the silent powerhouses where kingdoms were advised, destinies shaped, and history itself was not just recorded, but profoundly, definitively, authored. For all the rigid discipline, the sacred silence, and the ceaseless prayers, the medieval monastery was still, at its heart, a collection of human beings. And where humanity exists, so too does temptation. Beneath the pious surface, within the very soul striving for perfection, temptation stirred. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were immense burdens, daily challenges that not all could, or would, consistently uphold. Whispers of transgression, though vehemently suppressed, inevitably found their way through the thick stone walls. Some monks broke vows in secret, met lovers in the woods, hid wine in bookshelves. Not all who wore robes were saints. The allure of the world they had supposedly renounced was a constant, insidious adversary. The monastic life, while offering spiritual solace, was also one of extreme deprivation. Cold, hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless suppression of natural human desires created fertile ground for internal struggles. The vow of chastity was arguably the most difficult for many. Men entered the monastery at various ages, some as children dedicated by their families, others as adults seeking refuge or genuine spiritual calling. Regardless of their initial motivations, the natural urges of the body remained. The enforced celibacy was a constant battle, fought daily in the silence of their cells and the depths of their prayers. While many undoubtedly achieved profound spiritual purity, for others, the struggle was ongoing and sometimes lost. Whispers spoke of monks who found illicit comfort beyond the abbey walls, slipping away under the cloak of night to meet lovers in the woods. These clandestine encounters, shrouded in secrecy and danger, offered fleeting moments of forbidden intimacy, a desperate release from the crushing weight of their vows. Such transgressions, if discovered, carried severe penalties, from public penance and corporal punishment to expulsion, yet the risk was sometimes deemed worth the solace it provided. The woods, which offered wildness and mystery, also offered a cloak for human weakness, a contrast to the orderly, disciplined gardens of the abbey. The vow of poverty was similarly challenging. While the individual monk owned nothing, the monastery itself could be incredibly wealthy, as we've discussed. This communal wealth could foster a different kind of temptation, a desire for personal comfort or luxury that subtly undermined the spirit of the vow. While the refectory meals were typically plain, instances of gluttony were a known vice within monastic communities, leading to stricter rules on food preparation and consumption. More insidious was the desire for personal possessions or comforts. A monk might secretly hoard a small stash of dried fruit, a piece of fine cloth, or a personal trinket, small comforts that broke the spirit of his vow. And where there was illicit activity, there was often illicit gain. The temptation to divert a small portion of the abbey's vast income from trade, or to personally profit from dealings with the outside world, undoubtedly arose for some. Perhaps the most common, and most frequently mentioned in historical accounts, was the breaking of the vow of obedience and the temptation of worldly pleasures, particularly wine. While monks were allowed a daily measure of ale or wine as part of their diet, and brewed much of it themselves, excessive drinking was a perennial problem. The strict silence and monotonous routine could drive some to seek solace in the intoxicating effects of alcohol. Stories abounded, though usually whispered, of monks who hid wine in bookshelves, in their cells, or in other secret nooks, to be consumed in defiance of the communal limits and the spirit of sobriety. This wasn't just about simple indulgence, it was an act of rebellion against the very structure of their ordered lives, a desperate attempt to dull the edges of their existence or to escape the pressures of their spiritual obligations. The quiet hum of a hidden bottle, uncorked in the dead of night, was a profound act of personal defiance. Beyond these specific vows, the simple act of gossip or idle chatter was a constant temptation, breaking the sacred vow of silence. The human need for connection, for sharing stories and complaints, was powerful. The whispers that carried tales of visions, or of brothers who returned different, also carried rumors of internal conflicts, jealousies, and resentments, all of which undermined the ideal of brotherly love. The very structure of monastic life, designed to eradicate sin, inadvertently created environments where certain sins could flourish in secret. The enforced isolation, the close proximity of many men, the emotional and spiritual intensity of their lives, all these factors could exacerbate human weaknesses. Some monks entered the cloister not out of genuine piety, but out of desperation, coercion, or as a convenient way to escape secular responsibilities or legal troubles. These men often brought with them worldly habits and unresolved moral conflicts, making them more susceptible to temptation. It's crucial to remember that not all who wore robes were saints. The medieval church, like any large human institution, was composed of a wide spectrum of individuals. While countless monks lived lives of genuine devotion, profound sanctity, and extraordinary spiritual discipline, others struggled daily, succumbed to temptation, or even cynically exploited their positions for personal gain. History, both secular and ecclesiastical, is replete with accounts of corruption, sexual misconduct, and worldly ambition within monastic orders, even as the ideal of monastic purity remained powerful. These secret transgressions, precisely because they occurred within the sacred walls, often added a layer of complexity and tension to monastic life. They were the shadows that proved the light, the imperfections that highlighted the ideal, and a constant reminder that the path to spiritual perfection was arduous, fraught with human failing, and often walked by deeply flawed men beneath the habit. The abbey, for all its outward sanctity, was also a stage for the timeless drama of human temptation, played out in hushed tones, behind locked doors, and beneath the veil of unwavering piety. The monastic ideal, as enshrined in the rule of Saint Benedict, was one of rigorous self-discipline and profound spiritual purity. But the reality, as we've seen, was often far more complex. When the human frailties, the hidden temptations, and the secret transgressions of the monks came to light, the consequences were swift and often terrifyingly severe. Punishments were brutal. A single misstep could lead to isolation, whipping, or worse, burial in a walled cell with no door, left to die with only a candle and a Bible. The abbey, despite its spiritual purpose, was also a meticulously ordered society with its own rigid legal and penal system. The abbot, as the embodiment of Christ and the ultimate authority within the monastery, held absolute power over his brethren. His judgment, while ideally tempered with mercy, could be unsparing, particularly when faced with actions that threatened the spiritual integrity or the reputation of the entire community. For minor infractions, a muttered complaint during silence, a monk found dozing during matins, a careless mistake in the scriptorium, or a fleeting moment of anger, the punishment might be public humiliation. This could involve kneeling at the chapter house door during meals, eating on the floor, or being excluded from the communal table. Such acts, though seemingly minor, were deeply shaming in a community where conformity and obedience were paramount. More serious breaches, like repeated disobedience, insubordination, or the breaking of silence in a significant way, could lead to physical punishment. Whipping, often administered in the chapter house before the assembled community, was a common disciplinary tool. The sting of the lash on bare skin was not just about inflicting pain, it was a public spectacle of humiliation and correction, designed to serve as a stark warning to all who witnessed it. The pain was intended to purify, to drive out the sin, and to bring the wayward monk back to the path of obedience. Records from various abbeys show monks being admonished for everything from incorrect singing during services to wandering outside the cloister without permission, with beatings a prescribed punishment for persistent offenders, but for the gravest offenses, repeated sexual transgression, theft from the abbey, apostasy, renouncing vows, or serious acts of defiance that undermined the abbot's authority, the consequences could be truly chilling. The most severe punishment short of outright execution, which would typically involve handing the monk over to secular authorities, was a form of living death within the monastery walls, burial in a walled cell with no door. This was the ultimate anathema, a terrifying application of the vow of stability to its most brutal extreme. A monk guilty of such a heinous crime would be led to a small, often windowless chamber, deep within the abbey's foundations or a secluded, forgotten corner. The cell would be barren, save for the most minimal provisions, a single candle, perhaps a pitcher of water, and a Bible or crucifix, a stark reminder of the spiritual redemption that was now, seemingly, forever out of reach. Then, with the accused monk inside, the doorway would be meticulously bricked up, stone by stone, until no trace of an opening remained. The monk was literally interred, alive, within the monastic complex he had betrayed. Left to die with only a candle and a Bible, this punishment was a prolonged and agonizing end. The candle would eventually extinguish, plunging the cell into absolute, eternal darkness. The water would run out. Hunger and thirst would claim the body, while the profound psychological torment of absolute isolation and impending death would prey on the mind. The Bible, meant for solace, would become a torment, a testament to the salvation he had forfeited. This was not merely execution, it was a spiritual eradication, a deliberate erasure from the community of the living, a horrifying penance designed to serve as a perpetual, silent warning to any who contemplated similar transgressions. Such extreme punishments, while perhaps rare, underscore the absolute authority of the abbot and the medieval church's unwavering commitment to spiritual purity and monastic order. They were a stark reflection of a world that viewed sin not just as a personal failing, but as a dangerous contagion that threatened the entire fabric of sacred society, demanding the most brutal surgical removal. The silent power of the monastery extended even into the grave, or rather, the living tomb, of those who dared to break its sacred, unbreakable vows. For all the hidden shadows, the whispered transgressions, and the grim realities of medieval justice, it is vital to remember the overwhelming truth. Beneath the surface of power, mystery, and human frailty, many monks truly believed. They embodied the very ideals that drew men to the cloister, serving with unwavering humility, kindness, and purpose. Their lives, though austere and often unseen by the wider world, were a testament to genuine faith and a profound dedication to God and humanity. These were the silent majority, the countless brethren who rose before dawn, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a deep and abiding love for their Creator. They found genuine solace in the rhythmic chants, profound meaning in the sacred texts, and a clear purpose in the structured discipline of their days. For them, the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were not burdens to be secretly circumvented, but pathways to spiritual liberation, a means to shed worldly attachments and draw closer to the divine. Their humility was often genuine, expressed in quiet service, self-effacement, and a profound respect for their brethren and the rule. Their kindness extended far beyond the monastery walls. Driven by the core Christian principle of charity, monks were often the primary caregivers and social safety nets in an era devoid of state-sponsored welfare. They taught the poor to read, not just scripture, but often the rudiments of letters and numbers, opening up a world of knowledge otherwise closed to the illiterate masses. Monastic schools, particularly in the earlier Middle Ages, were often the only places where even children from noble families could receive an education, let alone the children of commoners who might be fortunate enough to receive instruction. This act of teaching, born of patience and compassion, was a quiet revolution, sowing the seeds of literacy and intellectual curiosity across generations. Beyond formal education, monks provided essential relief to the suffering. The monastic infirmaries, staffed by those skilled in herbal medicine, offered care to the sick and infirm, both from within the community and from the surrounding villages. They distributed food to the hungry, provided shelter to travelers and pilgrims, and often acted as mediators in local disputes, their moral authority stemming from their perceived impartiality and piety. During times of plague and famine, when secular authorities often struggled or abandoned their posts, monasteries frequently remained open, their gates offering refuge, their bells calling out for the dead, and their monks performing acts of selfless compassion, often at great personal risk. Perhaps their most enduring legacy, however, was their tireless dedication to knowledge. In a turbulent age marked by invasions, political upheaval, and widespread illiteracy, the monasteries became the vital custodians of civilization. They preserved knowledge through wars and plagues. While secular libraries crumbled and ancient texts were lost to neglect or destruction, monks in their scriptoria meticulously copied not only religious texts but also the philosophical treatises of ancient Greece and Rome, works of history, science, medicine, and literature. Without their painstaking, often monotonous, work, much of the classical heritage that underpins Western thought would have vanished entirely. Every illuminated manuscript, every carefully bound volume, was a triumph of dedicated labor over oblivion, a quiet act of defiance against the forces of decay and forgetfulness. These monks were the silent heroes of their age. They were the farmers who tilled the land, the builders who raised enduring stone, the brewers who crafted vital sustenance, and the scholars who kept the flame of learning alive. Their purpose was clear: to serve God through service to man, to embody Christian ideals in a world often far from ideal. Their humility, their unwavering faith, and their tireless, often uncelebrated contributions formed the true bedrock of the monastic movement, providing stability, charity, and intellectual light during some of Europe's darkest centuries. They sought not fame or fortune, but salvation, and in their pursuit, they inadvertently shaped the very foundations of Western civilization. In times of profound chaos, when the fabric of society frayed under the weight of invasion, famine, or disease, the seemingly insular world of the monastery often transformed into a last bastion of order and compassion. During barbarian invasions, when communities scattered and homes burned, their massive stone walls, built for spiritual defense, became literal fortresses. Terrified villagers, clutching their meager possessions, would stream towards the abbey gates, seeking sanctuary within the consecrated grounds. Monks, defying the rules' call for separation from the world, would open their doors, sheltering families in their cloisters, refectories, and outbuildings, providing what food and protection they could against the marauding forces. Even more harrowing was their role during times of plague. When the Black Death swept across Europe, decimating populations with horrifying speed, fear often led healthy villagers to abandon the sick and dying. Yet, within many monasteries, a different narrative unfolded. Monks, driven by their vows of charity and their unwavering faith in eternal life, bravely remained. They cared for the dying, offering what little comfort and spiritual solace they could. They heard final confessions, administered last rites, and prepared bodies for burial, often digging the graves themselves as the death toll mounted. They undertook these grim duties knowing full well that they, living in close communal quarters and in constant contact with the infected, would not survive the relentless scourge. Whole monastic communities were decimated, their numbers halved or more, a testament to their selflessness in the face of absolute terror, a quiet act of martyrdom amidst the chaos of death. Even today, centuries after their golden age, the medieval monasteries continue to hold their breath, guarding their layered histories and the profound complexities of the lives lived within their walls. For all the scholarly inquiry and archaeological excavation, many of their secrets remain. The vast and intricate world of the medieval monk, far from being a simple tale of piety, continues to resonate with untold stories and unresolved enigmas. Within ancient libraries, untranslated manuscripts await deciphering, their cryptic scripts and forgotten languages hinting at knowledge lost or deliberately obscured. Perhaps they contain more of the strange diagrams, the forbidden symbols, or the unsettling theories that once lay chained and hidden. New technologies might yet unlock passages that speak of visions beyond the divine, or provide clues to the true nature of the different brethren who returned from the wild. Beneath crumbling foundations and behind seemingly solid walls, hidden rooms lie undiscovered, concealed by centuries of dust and deliberate obscurity. What might they still hold? More secret vaults, perhaps, protecting relics of dubious origin, or containing artifacts of forgotten cults. Or might they contain the chilling remnants of a monk's final, desperate moments, bricked away from the world? And for those with discerning eyes, coded messages in plain sight still await interpretation. The whimsical drolleries in the margins of holy texts, those dancing skeletons and hybrid beasts, continue to pose questions. Were they merely jokes, or profound warnings, or the desperate, subversive cries of souls yearning for expression? Could they hold deeper, symbolic meanings, waiting for a modern scholar to unlock a forgotten monastic code of wit and dissent? The very stones of these ancient abbeys, now often silent ruins or repurposed structures, are imbued with the echoes of lives lived with an intensity almost unimaginable today. They whisper not only of profound devotion, of endless prayer, selfless service, and diligent preservation of knowledge through the darkest ages. But they also carry the undeniable echoes of defiance, of broken vows, of hidden luxuries, of cunning political maneuvering, and of the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The medieval monastery was a microcosm of the human experience, a sanctuary for faith, a crucible for intellect, a stage for power, and a silent witness to both the highest spiritual aspirations and the most enduring human frailties. Its walls, once thought to separate it entirely from the world, in fact reflected and magnified all of its complexities. And in their enduring secrets, the monks of the medieval age continue to beckon us, reminding us that true history is rarely simple, and that the deepest mysteries are often found not in distant lands, but within the silent, sacred, and often shadowed confines of the human heart. They were watchers, observing the world from behind thick walls, guarding both sacred relics and forbidden knowledge, sometimes acting as silent historians or even covert power brokers. They were healers, tending to the sick with ancient herbal wisdom, capable of both alleviating suffering and, in darker whispers, discreetly ending lives. They were rebels, subtly defying the strictures of silence with their strange marginalia, or secretly breaking vows for illicit pleasures. They were sinners, grappling with the same temptations of the flesh, greed, and ambition as any man, sometimes succumbing in clandestine moments. And yet, overwhelmingly, they were saints, men of profound faith, unwavering humility, and immense charity, dedicating their lives to prayer, preserving civilization through chaos, and offering sanctuary to the vulnerable. All these diverse, often conflicting, roles and human experiences were cloaked in the same humble robe, a uniform that belied the rich tapestry of devotion, defiance, intellect, and humanity woven into the very fabric of medieval monastic life. They were, in essence, the full spectrum of medieval man, distilled and intensified within the unique crucible of the cloister.